You need to learn to control your dreams.
Seriously.
It's like the gym. If you put the effort in, then you get to choose what you dream. But the method only works if you keep an open mind about things. About there being more than just what we see. Can you do that?
Do you ever wake up unsure if something actually happened, or the opposite? You are positive that something happened, only to find out much later in the day that it was all a dream. And all copyright credit goes to Biggie Smalls for that one. People put off sleeping for a number of reasons. Maybe you had a really long, grueling day of work and you just want some extra time to yourself, and so you put off sleeping a little bit. Maybe you're spending great time with friends and you just don't want it to end, and so you just decide to stay up. Or maybe you're terrified of going to sleep for one reason or another. Today, we are talking almost all things sleeping disorders. I say almost all because in the DSM-5, so the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders that us mental health professionals use in the US to diagnose people with mental health disorders, there are 10 different sleep disorders that can exist. So we are not going to cover all of those today, obviously. We're going to be talking about 4 of them, and included in that will be lucid dreaming. And so lucid dreaming isn't actually in the DSM because it's not a disorder. It's not something that merits a diagnosis. It's a normal variation of sleeping, and it's something that you can actually learn, but I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself here. So hi everybody, for those that don't know me, my name is Sabrina, and I'm a clinical psychologist, and on this channel, I talk to you about psychology that we can see in popular Netflix series and shows. And I want to give a special shout out, special thank you to the 70 plus people that filled out this poll saying that they would like to see a video on sleep disorders. So this one's for you. And for those of you watching this past midnight, you know who you are. I'm talking to you. I'm going to ask you to just add this video to your watch later list and go to bed. Today I'll be using clips from the show Behind Her Eyes on, you guessed it, Netflix. And you don't have to be a fan of the show to watch my videos as always. And there won't be any spoilers in this videos for people who might be like me and did not hear of this show back in 2021 when it was incredibly popular. I literally watched it last week. Okay, so we're going to start by talking about the 4 sleep stages. Now, certain sleep disorders happen in one stage of sleep and others can happen in another stage. And so it's really, really important to understand these sleep stages so you can get a better sense of what happens in certain sleep disorders and why certain things don't happen. So skip this video at your own risk of not understanding what I'm talking about later on. The first 3 stages of sleep are considered non-REM sleep, with the 4th stage of sleep being REM sleep. We cycle through all 4 of these stages multiple times during the night, with each total cycle lasting about 90 minutes. So let's start with stage 1. This is our lightest phase of sleep, and people who have insomnia normally have an issue in this phase of sleep. And so this is where we're in between being awake and actually being asleep. So things might start to happen, like our muscles might start to twitch a little bit, our thoughts might wander, but we can be easily awoken. So imagine your dad who's sitting there on the recliner, who is definitely asleep, but when you try to say, hey, dad, wake up, he'll say, I wasn't sleeping. I was just resting my eyes. He's probably in this phase of sleep. And then our next phase is stage 2 of sleep. This is also light sleep, but a little bit deeper than the other phases of sleep. So here our heart rate slows, our body temperature drops, and we start to become unaware of our surroundings. It might surprise you to know that for most people, we spend about 50% and in some over 50% of our sleep in this stage and not in the REM stage, like a lot of people might think. So now we move into stage 3, and this is known as our deep sleep or our slow wave sleep. And this is where if people have issues such as things like night terrors, sleepwalking, they occur in this phase of sleep. So lock in, because this one's important. So in this stage, our heart rate and blood pressure is at its lowest, and our muscles are relaxed. We start to lose muscle tone. This is not to be confused with our muscles being paralyzed. You might have heard about that before. We'll talk about that in the REM stage. And so this does not occur in this stage. Our muscles are just relaxed. So if you wake up in this stage and say you want to get a drink, grab a bottle of water, you might notice it's a little more effortful to open that bottle of water because your muscles are still weak. They're still kind of waking up. Now, this phase of sleep is our most physically restorative. So if you were going hard, pumping iron in the gym the night before, this stage is going to help you to build that muscle. It also helps with consolidating certain memories, so memories for facts and events. So if you've been studying hard for a test for a week, this phase of sleep is going to help you remember that the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. And now we have stage 4 sleep, which is REM sleep, and this is definitely the Beyonce of the group. It's called REM sleep because we have rapid eye movements with our eyelids being closed, but REM standing for rapid eye movements in this stage. And our brain activity is actually very similar to that of being awake. We have a lot of brain activity going on in this phase of sleep. And this is where a majority of dreaming occurs, including things like nightmares and lucid dreaming. So this is also an important sleep stage to pay attention to. Now, like I just mentioned, this stage is where our body temporarily paralyzes itself. And that's for our own safety. So we don't act out the things that we're dreaming, but it can be especially scary when we wake up in this phase of sleep. That's what happens in sleep paralysis. Like I just mentioned before, our brain is still awake. And so when we wake up in this phase, we are very much aware that we are awake, but our body's paralyzed, so we can't move for a period of seconds. Incredibly scary experience for anybody who's had it. Now, the REM sleep cycle gets longer as the night goes on, so majority of our dreaming actually occurs much later in the night because we have a longer opportunity to actually dream. Now, by now, a vast majority of the people have clicked off of this video, but for those of you that haven't yet, we need to talk about something important: sleep hygiene. Now, a lot of people know that if you're having trouble with sleeping, you can take certain medications. So maybe you can take a melatonin, which helps us in getting more drowsy, mimicking the natural melatonin that our body produces more and more throughout the day, which makes us more and more tired as the day goes on. But the vast majority of people, including you, would really notice improved sleep if you focused on your sleep habits a little bit more. I've worked with clients that have struggled with sleep for even decades at a time. And when they started to focus on sleep hygiene and changing some of their habits and behaviors around sleep, they didn't have issues with sleeping again. It's called sleep hygiene because think about hygiene generally. Just because a person brushes their teeth every day does not mean they have good hygiene. Just because they shower every day doesn't mean they have good hygiene, or because they wear deodorant every day. It's a combination of a lot of these things put together that make a good hygiene routine. And that's the same thing for sleep. Now, a common sleep hygiene tip that we've all heard that you probably didn't know was named this sleep hygiene under this category is putting away screens before bed. Some places say an hour before, some even say as long as 2 to 3 hours. The reason this is a tip is because the blue light from our phones kind of mimics the sun almost. It tricks our brain into thinking that we should be awake. And with our circadian rhythms, which is the natural way our body regulates and helps us get to sleep. It's on a 24-hour cycle, so when we wake up, it kind of slowly but surely throughout the day prepares us for sleep later at night. It interrupts the system because now we think, okay, I'm awake, and so you're going to have difficulty sleeping. And so that's why putting away screens can be so helpful. There are a couple other tips that I'll talk about in name. So one generally is kind of making your room a sleep sanctuary, they call it. So a lot of different things that you can do in your room to ensure that you can help better sleep. One big one is making sure that your bed is reserved for sleeping and sexual activity. Just those two things. You're not eating in your bed, you're not watching TV in your bed, you're not doing homework or studying for a big work presentation the next day. None of that. Because then when you get to sleep, your body's very confused. It's trying to figure out, well, what are we doing here now? Should we be eating? Should we be up watching TV? It's not just reserved for sleep. Whereas if you're only using it for that, as soon as you get in bed, there's no confusion. Your body knows, okay, time to go to bed now. And in that same vein, only entering bed when you are tired, when you are very sleepy. So not getting into bed just because it's my bedtime and I should go to sleep. That's only going to lead to you tossing and turning more. So getting into bed when you're actually tired, making sure it's dark enough in your room so you're not getting those rays of sunlight or light in your eyes that, again, is kind of tricking you to stay awake. So whether that's getting blackout curtains, a lovely sleep mask that blocks out all the sun, something that's helpful for you to make sure that you're not getting that light in before you want to wake up that's causing you to actually wake up. And same thing with noise, making sure you're limiting noise. And I know how people feel. There's some people who feel very strongly about, well, I gotta sleep with some kind of noise. I have to sleep with the TV on. Just recently, last week, I was actually working with a veteran who was having a lot of issues with sleeping. And one of the things that he said that he would do or that he needs to do is put on TV. But I asked him, okay, well, in the middle of the night, because he said he was struggling with frequent awakenings. So I said, do you ever notice that when you wake up that there was some kind of loud noise or something that happened in the TV show? And he said, yeah, all the time. I'm like, well, that's not the great part about watching TV, especially depending on what it is, because we can't anticipate when that show might change, or maybe a commercial's a lot louder than others and it wakes us up. So if you need some kind of noise, using a kind of white noise machine. Those are great because it just loops the same sound. There's no big crashes, anything like that. So using something like that is super beneficial, can help with drowning out, those garbage trucks that come by every weekday at 3 to 4 a.m. and just seem to throw the garbage into the garbage truck and wakes you up all the time in the middle of the night. Not that that happened to me or anything. And to actually go back in terms of making sure that your bed is reserved only for sleep, if you are in bed for 15 to 20 minutes and you are just tossing and turning, and get out of bed and do something that isn't too mentally stimulating and isn't too physically stimulating and doesn't involve the screens. Remember that. And so it might be reading a book. It might be maybe lightly folding the laundry that you left on your bed because you're too lazy to fold it earlier. Doing something to where you can start to kind of work off maybe some extra energy that you have, and then getting back into sleep. And it's really important when you do this not to be checking at clocks, because that can just lead to more anxiety of, oh my gosh, it's been over 2 hours and I haven't gotten to sleep. I only have this much time to sleep. I need to go to bed now, blah, blah, blah. And that's only going to make it harder for you. Another very important one is creating a sleep routine. So this just helps our brain know when to wind down during the day. And helpful things that we can do are things like, meditation or some kind of breathing to physically calm our body, maybe some light stretching, doing something like reading a book, maybe taking a bath. And taking a bath can be helpful because after a certain point, it actually, at first, we might be a little bit warmer if you're taking a warm bath, but then later your body temperature drops, which is great because when you sleep, your body temperature drops too, which is another thing about temperature in the room, making sure it's not too hot to sleep, because that'll interrupt that kind of normal process of your body needing to drop its temperature to sleep. So making sure it's not too hot, although some people like it that way, I guess, but sorry, it's probably going to impact your sleep if you continue to do that. And the last category that I'll talk about when it comes to sleep hygiene is physical activity and consumption. I mentioned a couple times not doing things too physically strenuous. That's because when we do, that signals our body to kind of be awake. Like if you notice after you do a workout that you might have a lot of energy, if you do it too close to bed, you're going to be too energized to go to sleep. So it's around, I believe, 2 to 3 hours in terms of a workout. Then in terms of consumption, making sure we're not drinking anything too close to bed, because, of course, it can lead to you waking up in the middle of the night needing to use the bathroom. I saw something recently, like some kind of article that talked about not drinking anything 3 hours before going to bed. I thought that is crazy long. There's no way I can do that. I always get so thirsty before bed. But I've tried it and have done it consistently. And since doing that, I do not wake up in the middle of the night to use the bathroom. It is a godsend. And so it is okay, although it might feel uncomfortable, to go to bed a little bit thirsty. So I'd recommend trying that, especially if you're always waking up and peeing a lot in the middle of the night. Recommend trying to cut back on that, as well as food. So if we have a big meal in our stomach, our body is trying to do two processes at once. It's trying to digest our food and it's trying to get us to sleep. And so when we sleep, things like digestion slows down. So if we have a huge meal in our stomach, we need to digest it. And so if you eat too close to bed, it's going to interrupt sleep for that reason, and you're just not going to feel comfortable. And especially depending on what you eat, this can lead to a lot of those other sleep disorders that we're talking about. And so it's not a myth about certain foods that you have that can lead to nightmares or night terrors or sleepwalking, whatever it is, to actually true. So limiting those things, especially if you do struggle with some sleep disorders, can be incredibly, incredibly helpful. Then there's alcohol use before bed. Now, I work in a drug and alcohol rehab center, so duh, of course, I was going to talk about this. Now, while alcohol can help you go to sleep quicker, I mean, it is a depressant, it kind of has this rebound effect that during the night when your body processes the alcohol out, it can interrupt your sleep cycle and actually lead you to being more awake. So I can think of the times where maybe I drank heavily before going to bed, maybe I went out with friends, whatever, and even if I went to sleep at, say, 2 a.m., I'm waking up at 6:30 or 7. I didn't get a full cycle of sleep, but I wake up feeling wide awake, although I'm exhausted. It's because that alcohol was interrupting my sleep cycle. And alcohol most severely impacts REM sleep. Remember, that's our Beyonce of the group. Most severely impacts that. So with my folks, I've talked about it before that I work with a large military population and a lot of people that have suffer from nightmares. And so a lot of times people might drink because they notice it does help with the nightmare, which if we think about it, since alcohol affects REM sleep, dreaming and nightmares happen in REM, that's actually pretty accurate. It can help with that because it's shortening and interrupting your REM sleep. But REM is so important. It's important for consolidating memories. It's important for helping us feel just physically rested. So a lot of times you might drink and get to sleep quicker and not have nightmares, but you wake up and you don't feel rested. That's because it impacted this phase of sleep. Now, I don't want you to stress thinking, okay, well, I don't do like 6 of the sleep hygiene tips that Sabrina just mentioned, so I'm going to have to radically change my life overnight. Pause, take a moment, and just pick 1 to 2 of the ones that I mentioned, maybe 1 to 2 of the ones that you absolutely never do, and maybe you notice it impacts your sleep the most. So, that client I talked about, how he noticed that he wakes up a lot in the middle of the night, and because he's always listening to TV, and when it changes, that wakes him up. That was one of the things we talked about. Okay, that's what you need to focus on. And he also mentioned that he sleeps with just the overhead light on, and where I work, that's a very harsh overhead light. So we talked about, okay, get a lamp. All right. So those were the 2 things for him. So thinking about 1 to 2 things for you that you can change. I would recommend some of the things to focus on is getting a bedtime routine. So really figuring out what your routine is. So having like a certain time, like on the iPhone, a lot of times you can set that bedtime alarm to let you know when it's time to get ready to go to sleep so you can start and engage in your routine so your body is used to a time that you should be winding down. So definitely recommend the sleep routine. Definitely recommend making bed a more sleep friendly zone. So like I was saying, sleep and sexual activity only in bed, and then doing things to create that sleep sanctuary. So whether it's finding ways to block out the light, block out the noise, those are some of the ones that I'd recommend. But again, very personal to you. So pick some and work out some of these. And the reason that I spent time talking about that is because a lot of the sleep disorders that we're going to talk about can be because we are not doing some of these things. So they can be brought on by things like sleep deprivation, and maybe we're deprived of sleep because we're not setting ourselves up for success when it comes to sleep. Okay, so let's actually get into the show and talk about these sleep disorders that we see present in the show. And sorry if you thought I was going to talk about things like astral projection or why David, the psychiatrist, is just not right in this show. I will not be talking about either of those things today. This video is on sleep disorders, which neither of those things are. So in the DSM-5, we can find these sleep disorders like nightmares, night terrors under a category that's actually called sleep-wake disorders. That's because some of these issues might involve problems actually staying awake, so things like narcolepsy, where people can't really stay awake and fall asleep everywhere, or they might happen when we are fully awake, things like restless leg syndrome. And yes, restless leg syndrome is in this category. Here's a list of all 10 of the sleep-wake disorders that we see in the DSM, and I'll touch on just some of the ones that aren't as popular, aren't as well known. So the first that I'll touch on is hypersomnolence. So that is sleeping too much, even if we've gotten like a full round of sleep. So say you got 7 hours of sleep, but you're still feeling incredibly exhausted and feel like you need another 3, or you actually go to bed for another 3 hours. There's the breathing related sleep disorders. So think like sleep apnea. And although we might hear about that a lot, this is not just a common thing. This is incredibly, incredibly serious. So if you experience this, you need to seek medical help like today. The circadian rhythms one is disruption in our sleep cycle, and this can occur due to things like prolonged jet lag or working a different shift, so not working like a day shift or working some kind of night shift, for example. And then finally, the REM sleep behavior disorders are things like actually acting out your dreams, which is abnormal because, as we remember in REM, your body's actually paralyzed. And so you shouldn't be acting any of these dreams out. So let's start with insomnia. Now, I saw a couple articles and forums that talked about how people felt that Adele in this show had insomnia. And when I was first watching it, I didn't really think about this or didn't really necessarily see that, but that's because there was a lot going on in the show. So let's talk a little bit about what goes into insomnia. Now, a lot of people think that insomnia is just difficulty with sleeping, difficulty falling asleep, but that's only one of the 3 ways that it can present. Now, in terms of difficulty falling asleep, this could be diagnosed as insomnia if it takes you more than 20 to 30 minutes to fall asleep. Now, when I first heard this in grad school, I was absolutely gobsmacked because I could count on one hand at that point, and still now I could count on 2 hands, but it's not more than 10, the amount of times I've actually gotten to sleep in that window. For me, it's normally 40 minutes, an hour. That just doesn't happen for me, but apparently there are some of you lucky souls out there that does happen for, so very happy for you. But another form of insomnia is also frequent awakenings during the night if you'd already been asleep for a period of 20 to 30 minutes. And then after this, we see that this person will have difficulty going back to sleep. So another check in my box for me, those times when I do have to get up and use the bathroom and get up and go pee, when I get back in bed, it's taken me another hour to get back to sleep. And the last kind is this early awakening. So you wake up at least 30 minutes before you wanted to, so at least 30 minutes before your alarm. And by that point that you wake up, you haven't yet gotten, I think it's around 6.5 hours of sleep. So say you wake up 30 minutes beforehand, but you've only gotten 5 hours of sleep by that point. And most people at this point, you can't go back to sleep at all. I mean, you only have 30 minutes. Another box, which I perfectly tick. So yay for being an overachiever, I guess. Now, these period of sleep difficulties have to happen at least 3 times a week for a period of 3 months. There is a version of insomnia, it's called short-term insomnia, where you can have these struggles and it lasts from 1 to 3 months, but again, it's typically that 3-month or more range. Now, another feature of insomnia is being unable to sleep when presented with ample opportunity to do so. So, for instance, if you wake up in the middle of the night and you can't go back to sleep because that garbage truck is around and they're throwing things in the garbage truck and having an over 30-minute conversation with the valet person very, very loudly outside of your window. Again, not that happened to me. You didn't have ample opportunity to get to sleep because, like we talked about in the sleep hygiene tips, that noise really does impact our sleep. And so the environment is not set up in a way that it can lead you to getting good sleep. So in that sense, that person, me, at one point in time, wouldn't really be diagnosed with insomnia because I didn't have ample opportunity to go to sleep. And with every diagnosis in the DSM, insomnia has to impact you in a negative way. You're functioning in a negative way. And or it impacts you really negatively when it comes to social life. So maybe you're unable to spend time or hang out with friends because you're always falling asleep or having whatever other issues, or it impacts you work-wise. So because you're getting poor sleep, you're not able to function well at work, impacts you in some of these areas. But if you're struggling with sleep, but you're cool as a cucumber, couldn't actually give you this diagnosis. And that's where I somewhat struggle with Adele in this show and seeing her as having an insomnia diagnosis, because what we see is that it doesn't necessarily seem to impact her on a day-to-day basis, to impact her functioning or impact her in really a negative way. So we see that she wakes up every day and she goes on a run or she goes to train, she goes to the gym in some regard every single day, that she has enough time to paint a full mural on the wall, do this art project that she seemed to have a lot of fun with, cook an elaborate dinner for her and her husband. Like, it's not really impacting her life. And so in terms of her getting this diagnosis of insomnia, I don't know. I personally don't see it. Let's slowly move more into the heavy hitters in this show and talk about sleepwalking. Now, if you remember, if you saw my video that I did on adolescence, you'll see that with those names that are not classic English American names, and it seems like especially the UK names, that I will just struggle. I mean, you saw me struggle with the name Bryony. I don't even know if I'm saying it right now in that video. And here we have somebody named Louise. And so I probably will call her Lois at some point or many points during this video. So I'm just saying that up front. I apologize to the UK. I just can't figure out your names. And the crazy thing is, my grandma used to live in London. I've been to London 6 or 7 times, spending up to a month at a time in London. And so I should have this down by now, but I just don't. So sorry. So anyway, with Louise, we see her struggle with sleepwalking early on in the series, even almost sleepwalking right off of her balcony. And so for any nerds out there, the actual term, the official term for sleepwalking is somnambulism, but during this video, I will just be saying sleepwalking. Something to note right off the bat is that this is pretty uncommon in adults and actually pretty common in children. So, some studies have shown that up to around 4% of adults will experience sleepwalking. So, that's about 1 in 25 people, whereas up to 30% of children, normally 30%, will suffer from some kind of sleepwalking. And this number will go up, say, if one parent or two parents sleepwalk themselves. And the thing is that most kids will grow out of this when they get to puberty. Now, remember, sleepwalking occurs in stage 3 sleep, which is why they can actually move because their muscles are relaxed but not paralyzed, but their brain is asleep, technically, which is why these people often look like zombies and why when they wake up, they don't really have any recollection of how they got from their bed to wherever they wake up being. While people can simply walk around their house, and this is often what we think of when we think of sleepwalking, people can also do pretty complex activities. So they can do things like eating or cooking a meal, moving around furniture. Some people actually run, so not sleepwalking, more sleep running. And then some people even engage in some kind of sexual activity while sleepwalking. And there's a name for this. It's known as sexsomnia, which is just very scary. But remember, this person is asleep. So when we are asleep, we lack coordination and we lack complex thinking skills. So this person might be eating inedible objects, or they might wake up the next day and see that their kitchen is absolutely trashed and they have this half cooked meal laying around with a bunch of weird ingredients. Or maybe when they were moving furniture, they see that they placed a lamp on the couch. If you're a parent, or say you have a roommate that sleepwalks and you worry about them, this usually occurs in the early half of sleep. So, around the first 2 to 3 hours of a person falling asleep. So, be on the lookout for it then. And, oh, you can wake a sleepwalker. It's a myth that you can't. It's just really, really hard to do so because, again, they are in deep sleep. And when you do wake them up, they'll be incredibly disoriented because, again, they were sleeping very, very deeply. So, first, I would recommend instead of trying to wake them, just gently try and guide them back to bed. And while their eyes might be open and they might be looking at you, they are not registering that you are there. Like, they cannot actually really see you. And so, you might have to physically guide them back to bed. So, like I mentioned before, if this is not as common in adults, what's going on with Louise? Is she just one of that 4% of people? Well, first, she does mention that this has been happening to her since childhood. And an even smaller percentage of adults, it's about less than 1% of adults, will sleepwalk in their adulthood and have never done so when they were kids. So, likely, if an adult is sleepwalking, they did when they were a child as well. Now, research has shown that sleepwalking in adults can actually be linked to a lot of different things. So, it can be linked to stress and anxiety, kind of common one, what we would think can be linked to some kind of fatigue and sleep deprivation, which is likely some of the things that's happening with Louise because she's having those kind of scary dreams and they're waking her up. So she's likely deprived of sleep because of that. It can happen as a result of certain medications that you might be taking. So, especially sedatives is where that can happen. Alcohol consumption before bed, which we do see Louise a couple times, drinking, but nothing crazy. And medical conditions like seizures. Now, I want to talk about safety when it comes to sleepwalking. I can't remember what the show was, but a couple years ago, I watched a show where basically a person booby trapped their room for them. They put different objects in the way of their door and around the house to make sure that they wouldn't sleepwalk, because I think this person was sleepwalking and actually leaving their house. So they tried to put things in the way to make sure they wouldn't do that. And while that's less dangerous than just walking off of a balcony, like Lois almost does, this can still result in some physical danger. So, for instance, you can still, because you are sleepwalking and your brain is basically off, depending on what object you put, you can really severely hurt yourself. So, what I might recommend is making it just a little bit more difficult, but still in a safe way. So, it might be putting some kind of really, really slick gel on your door handle. So, when you go to grab it and leave your room, you physically can't, because again, our coordination is not as on point when we're in this stage, so you actually can't. If you can get out of your room, I recommend doing things like baby proofing the house, right? So taking sharp objects out of the way, making sure sharp corners are safe, putting a safety gate at the top of the stairs, so that way when you try to walk off the stairs, you can't. So doing things like that to make sure that you're safe. Oh, and locking and securing things like your doors and windows, which we see in Behind Her Eyes that Lois leaves not just her bedroom door wide open when she goes to sleep, but leaves her balcony door open, which is how she almost walks off the balcony. So, truly not setting yourself up for success there, Louise, especially when you know that you have sleepwalking issues. Now, going into nightmares and night terrors, these are the heavy, heavy hitters here in this show. They are often confused, but psychologically, they are worlds apart. So, like I mentioned earlier, night terrors happen in non REM phases of sleep, and nightmares happens during REM sleep. So, that should already start to tip you off about some of the differences that can be occurring with these two conditions. So, let's talk about the two of these and decide which of the two, if any of the two, we feel that Louise might be suffering from. And don't worry, again, like I said, you don't have to watch the show to know this. So I'm going to talk with you about some of her symptoms and some of her conditions. And that way we can judge together and try to guess together at what condition we feel she's suffering from. So starting with night terrors, this happens in phase 3 of sleep, like I mentioned, which is our deep sleep. And so remember, the muscles are relaxed, but they are not paralyzed. So somebody experiencing night terrors, very commonly, they might yell, scream, flail about or move about. So they might be punching things in the air during this phase of sleep. And they might seem extremely confused or scared. It seems like they're in a heightened state of fear. They're really difficult to wake because, again, they're in this deep sleep. And as an onlooker, although it looks like this person's really, really suffering, and sometimes they might be, well, it looks like they're really suffering, and they might even be yelling out for help while they're experiencing these night terrors. Because they're in this stage 3 of sleep, when they wake up, very, very typically, they're not going to remember it. It's actually atypical if somebody does remember experiencing a night terror. If your partner or somebody that you live with has sleep terrors, just like sleepwalking, it occurs in the earlier phases of sleep. So that's when to kind of brace yourself forward and be prepared to intervene if you so choose, and maybe if that person tells you to intervene. And I mention if you so choose or if that person tells you, because typically for people with night terrors, they'll actually go back to bed. So even though they might sit up and start screaming and flailing around and all of that, after a period of time, they usually fall back asleep. So you don't necessarily have to do something. The tough part is night terrors can last anywhere from 1 minute to around 20 to 30 minutes. Some studies and articles I looked at even said something like 45 minutes that it can last. And so if you really like screaming is very loud, or it's just hard for you to say, maybe watch your child going through that, you can wake this person up. But again, just like I mentioned, you don't necessarily, they will fall back asleep on their own typically. And because of that, they're not usually in any kind of danger, like unless when they're flailing, throwing things, like I said, unless they're actually punching walls or hitting themselves, you might not have to physically intervene in that way because they usually won't leave their beds. Like this isn't sleepwalking, right? So unless they have both, they often won't leave their beds. They'll probably stay in bed and scream and yell and punch things. And so if that's not happening, they might not be in any present danger. Again, you can let them sleep, but that is very personalized to you, the person who's experiencing. Maybe they tell you that they want you to wake them up. So I'm not saying that. Don't do that. Kind of have that conversation about it. So to recap, night terrors happen during deep sleep, The person will usually flail and thrash about and scream and yell because their muscles aren't paralyzed, they're just relaxed. They can do all those things, and they often do not remember this occurring when they wake up. So let's jump into nightmares. Remember that nightmares occur in REM sleep, and they usually occur much later in the night because the longer we're asleep, the longer and longer these REM sleep cycles happen. Because we are paralyzed in this stage, movement of any kind or any kind of vocalizations are uncommon. Now, what we often see is that when people wake up, they might scream, or people say, I screamed myself awake. That sometimes can be the case, but it's likely that they were already out of that phase of REM. They might have gone into that phase 1 sleep where they were in between being awake and asleep, and that's when that happened. And so it's not like they're actively in the dream and screaming. When a person wakes up after having a nightmare, they can very much remember what occurred. They can remember what went on. And nightmares will actually often wake a person up from their sleep, where night terrors typically don't, right? Typically, another person has to wake you up from a night terror. But when awake from a nightmare, you become rapidly reoriented and aware of where you are and your surroundings. This doesn't happen with night terrors because, again, it's in that deep phase of sleep. So once you wake up, it takes a little bit of time to reorient yourself to where the heck am I? This is pretty common knowledge, but the adults that typically suffer from nightmares are often those diagnosed with PTSD. It's seen so commonly that this is actually one of the criteria for meeting a diagnosis of PTSD, is that you can be experiencing these nightmares. And this says something because in general, children are way more likely to experience nightmares than adults. So it says something that nightmares is so common for this group of people. And I do plan to cover PTSD in a video that I'll be filming pretty soon. I'm just waiting for this film that I plan to use in the video to come back to Netflix, which it will before the end of the month. And so leave a comment below if you have a guess at what that film might be that I'll use for that video on PTSD. Now, in America, it's not uncommon to busy ourselves, whether intentionally or unintentionally, to busy ourselves so much that we don't have time to think, or to actively be trying to avoid thinking about things in the case of trauma or in the case of emotions like shame, for instance. The thing is that our brains will force us to do so when we sleep. One of the functions of sleeping is to help us with processing any unresolved trauma or unresolved conflict, basically, that we might have. During the day, we are more active and able to more mentally use these defenses that can help us with avoiding or not thinking about certain conflicts, certain trauma. But when we're asleep, we don't have that capability. Our mind is not as active in that way. And so if you maybe suffer from trauma and maybe you're resonating with some of what I'm saying in terms of trying to avoid thinking about it, that takes a toll on you mentally. Like, that's a lot of work to be able to do that. And like I said, we can't do all of that work when we're asleep, which is why it makes sense that people who have PTSD experience nightmares so commonly, because a huge feature of PTSD is avoidance. Again, that's 2 criteria, and you actually have to be avoiding in some regard to get a diagnosis of PTSD, whether it be certain thoughts or external things that remind you of the trauma, like certain people or certain places. You're avoiding certain things. And so, of course, when you're sleeping, it's going to come up because you're continuing to avoid it instead of resolving it. So to recap, nightmares happen during REM sleep, so don't involve like moving or screaming in our sleep. When we wake up, we do remember them, and they usually wake us up, but when we do wake up, we're able to reorient to our environment very quickly. Now that we've talked about both nightmares and night terrors, let's get to the bottom of what Lois is. See? Just did it. Lois. What Louise is really suffering from in this series, because the public opinion is all over the place. So in this series, we see that when Louise starts to dream, she will pretty quickly start sleepwalking. Now, the exact time frame is unclear, but in the episode where she does almost walk off of her balcony, it appears to be that she starts sleepwalking less than an hour, within an hour of going to sleep. She also always remembers these dreams when she wakes up, and it seems that something that happens in these dreams will kind of startle her awake, so they wake her up, and then when she does wake up, she might scream or she might cry from them. Can you guess what sleep disorder she has? Give you a second. If you're confused, Don't worry, because I personally don't think that she has nightmares or night terrors, at least not how we would strictly diagnose them according to the DSM. In the show, it often references her dreams as night terrors, and Louise even mentioned that doctors dismissed it as that because she remembered them. Then Adele tells her, well, it's rare, but that happens, that sometimes people can remember them. And while that is true, we wouldn't really expect her to be remembering these night terrors every single time that she's having them. So every single night. Maybe a handful of times, but not every single time. And this is why the fantasy of a scripted series won't always match reality. Now, we don't know for sure, but there's no public information indicating that a mental health professional helped with the scripting or helped with the filming of this series. And we know, well, maybe you all don't know, and I didn't really actually know until I Googled this, but that this series was inspired by the book Behind Her Eyes, written by Sarah Pinborough, who is not a mental health professional herself. For those who did watch the series, in the end, it dips more into that realm of fantasy, and it seems like it's blurring the lines and kind of dipping a little bit into that realm of fantasy when it comes to these night terrors, nightmares. Now, Louise shows clear signs of non-REM sleep disorders in terms of sleepwalking primarily, but also shows signs of REM sleep issues. So repeated distressing dreams that she remembers in which she's reliving the death of her mom and not being able to catch her son that seems to be in some kind of danger. The thing is, you can't really be formally diagnosed with both night terrors and nightmares because they occur in different sleep cycles. This show often sets up the narrative that Adele and Louise are special or different in some way, and so she must be really special because this isn't really possible. Now, I would be tempted to think that because she is under a lot of stress or sleep deprived, that's why this is happening, which that might be the case in some instances, but because she did mention that she started when she was a child, that kind of takes me away a little bit from that line of thought. Unless her childhood was just so incredibly stressful every single moment to where she couldn't, catch a break, I wouldn't expect this to be a plausible explanation for what's happening with her sleep. So yet another example about how mental health professionals might depict something as reality that's not necessarily the case, which is my constant gripe with how media portrays us, including David, the psychiatrist in this series with how he's portrayed too. Like I said, I'm not talking about it in this video, but just yikes on how they portray him in this show. Okay, so moving into our final bonus sleep theme, which is lucid dreaming. So remember, this isn't in the DSM because this is not a disorder. This is a variation of normal dreaming. And the neat thing is that you can actually teach yourself to lucid dream if you like. The show is actually very accurate in how they depict this, in which they're showing Adele and also kind of Rob by proxy teaching Louise how to kind of learn herself how to start lucid dreaming. And they're doing so by using one of the more common strategies used to help a person with lucid dreaming, which is basically a form of reality testing. So Rob is a character that was in a mental facility with Adele, and in his diary that Adele gives to Louise, they mention things like pinching yourself. So if you feel the pain doing this, that you're awake. Saying, I am awake every hour, and counting your fingers. So if you have more than 5 on one hand, you're dreaming. So these techniques are meant to help people better differentiate between when they're awake and when they're sleeping and dreaming. And the more you do this more consistently, then the more likely you are to do this when you're dreaming. And we actually see that happen with Louise. So she's very consistent about practicing these skills every day, multiple times a day. And then what happens when she eventually does lucid dream is that she remembers the skill and she checks her hands to see that she has more than 5 fingers and realizes, I'm dreaming. So if you never do something while you're awake, it'd be pretty uncommon and kind of unusual for you to do it while you're asleep. So if you all remember, they actually do this in the movie Inception too. And so they use totems, which are kind of objects that can help anchor them to reality, because in the movie, they're going between things that are real and things that are not all the time. And a very famous one that left a lot of people wondering at the end, a lot of discussion, is the spinning top. And so in reality, if you have a top after a period of time, it's going to stop spinning. It's going to fall over. But when you're in a dream, it doesn't. Now, there are points in Behind Her Eyes where Adele tells Louise that in her dream to picture a door. So especially if she is kind of struggling and realizes she's in the middle of a distressing dream, to picture a door as a way to get her to the lucid dreaming, to a more positive dream that she can have. Again, a very accurate depiction of what happens, what can happen with lucid dreaming. And there's two big things that's helpful in this picture a door method. The first is that sometimes people find it difficult to wake themselves up when they are lucid dreaming. And so you can picture a door as a way to imagine on the other side is you being awake. So when you open the door, then it can actually help you to wake up once you step through it. Now, the second thing it can be helpful with is that, especially when you just first start lucid dreaming, our brain is still held to the conventions of the regular world. And so, yes, you might be flying, which we don't do in the regular world, but you're likely flying above places that you've actually been before, or that you've read in books in great details, or that you've seen pictures of or seen videos of. It's likely not going to be a place you're unfamiliar with, or a place that you can create yourself, right? And when we think of the idea of teleportation, for instance, that doesn't exist in regular human life. And so being able to, if you're in one place in your lucid dream and just all of a sudden going to another place, can be really hard to do when our mind is stuck on the fact that teleportation doesn't actually exist. So this picture door can be helpful if you picture a different place on the other side of it, which we see a lot happen in the show, right? That they picture somewhere more pleasant, they open the door and they go to it. Because when we think of a door, that symbolizes leaving one place you're going to enter into another, right? You're leaving your house if you're going out of your front door to enter into outside. So it's helpful to kind of picture a door because it helps your brain in the sense of I'm leaving somewhere and going somewhere else. So the show really did do a good job about depicting some things about sleep very accurately in the show. So I don't want to be too harsh on them. When it comes to things like the night terrors and the insomnia, they can use a little bit of work. So a reminder that if you suffer from sleep issues, that you can always seek professional help for this too. And in some cases where you're suffering from some sleep issues that could be life-threatening, like sleep apnea, I highly, highly, highly recommend that you do seek some kind of professional help.